September 1944. A crowded dance hall in Verdun, France. The air is thick with cigarette smoke and the frantic, hopeful rhythm of a swing band. Corporal William Hayes stands near the edge of the floor, his uniform pressed, his face weary but bright. A young French woman approaches him. She smiles and gestures toward the music. They step onto the floor together, two strangers caught in a moment of fragile peace. Then, the music dies. Military police burst through the doors. They do not look for enemies or deserters. They head straight for the dance floor. They grab the corporal by the arms, dragging him toward the door, while the woman screams in protest. He is a soldier on valid leave. Yet he is thrown into a jeep like a criminal. By dawn, his record will be stained by a lie. A soldier's dignity is about to be measured against a general's iron will. This is the story of what Patton did when MPs arrested a soldier for accepting a French woman's invitation to dance. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show what happens when old hierarchies met new realities. Corporal William Hayes was 24, born and raised in Baltimore, Maryland, and a member of the 366th Infantry Regiment. Before the war, he worked as a foreman in a textile mill, a job that taught him the value of steady hands and quiet discipline. He had seen the brutal reality of the front lines in Italy and the slow, grueling push through the hedgerows of Normandy, losing friends to artillery fire and cold, indifferent steel. He was a man who moved with a deliberate, unassuming grace, always keeping his head down and his service record spotless. He arrived in Verdun on authorized leave, looking for nothing more than a quiet night away from the mud and the memories of the shelling. He sat alone at the edge of the dance hall, a solitary figure in a crisp, clean uniform, waiting for the music to offer some small comfort. Staff Sergeant Carl Dunlap was 31, an MP patrol leader from Dayton, Ohio, who wore his authority like a heavy, suffocating shroud. Dunlap operated under a rigid, self-imposed code that saw the world strictly through the lens of his own inherited prejudices. He believed that the chaos of war did not excuse the breaking of social order, and he enforced this belief with a cold, relentless obsession. His uniform was always pressed to a razor edge. His boots shone with a mirror-like finish that caught the light of the lamps, and he carried his sidearm with a menacing, performative weight. Dunlap believed that power was not for service, but for maintaining a hierarchy he felt was slipping away. He walked the streets of Verdun with his eyes narrowed, searching for any breach of his personal rules, convinced that he was the only one holding the line against a world that was changing too fast for his liking. By September 1944, the Allied advance across France had become a headlong sprint toward the German border. Supply lines were stretched to the breaking point, and the logistical pressure was immense. As the front moved rapidly east, the rear areas behind the lines became a patchwork of liberated towns and provisional military occupation. Chaos was the baseline. Local economies were struggling to restart under the thumb of military administration, and the friction between the incoming American liberators and the local French population was constant. This environment created a dangerous void where local commanders often operated with unchecked discretion. In many rear sectors, the lack of centralized oversight allowed individual officers, or NCOs, to impose their own prejudices under the guise of maintaining order. While the Army officially maintained policies against segregation, enforcement was sporadic and often depended on the whim of whoever was wearing the stars or the stripes on the ground. Other officers had looked the other way, choosing to ignore the small, ugly instances of discrimination that bubbled up in the occupied towns rather than deal with the bureaucratic headaches that came with challenging them. It was a time when the rules of the battlefield were clear, but the rules of human conduct were being rewritten on the fly by men who believed their authority was absolute. The atmosphere in Verdun was particularly tense, as the city served as a vital hub for movement and logistics, bringing together soldiers from all walks of life and local citizens trying to reclaim a sense of normalcy. The stage was set for a collision between personal bigotry and the rigid, cold structure of military justice as the city lights flickered over the dance hall and the music played on. Captain Robert Miller, a man of 40, with a weary face and a captain's bars on his collar, walked into the station, his boots clicking on the floor. He spotted Dunlap at the desk, meticulously folding a document. Miller signaled with a calm, practiced wave. "Dunlap, we have a problem with the intake on the Hayes arrest," Miller said. The sergeant did not look up, his posture rigid. "There is no problem, Captain. Just standard procedure." Miller leaned over the desk, hands clasped. "He's on valid leave, has a clean record, and there are 3 witnesses who say he was invited to dance. The woman was French, and that's a bad look for our discipline," Dunlap countered, his voice flat. "Discipline is not the issue, and you know it," Miller replied, his tone hardening. "You wrote that he was drunk, but the medic's log shows a clean sobriety test within 10 minutes of the incident." Dunlap finally looked up, his eyes cold and narrow. "I don't care what the medic says. I have a standing rule about who dances with who in this sector." Miller's jaw set, his patience thinning. "That is not a regulation, and you have no authority to invent one, Sergeant. I am ordering you to release him and clear the record before this becomes a matter for the command staff." Dunlap shook his head, a thin, arrogant smile spreading across his face. "I'm keeping him in the cell, Captain, because he needs to learn his place, and frankly, I don't answer to you on how I run my patrol." Miller stared at him for a long, silent moment, recognizing the immovable wall of prejudice in front of him. "You are making a massive mistake, Dunlap," he said quietly. "I am maintaining order," Dunlap spat, leaning forward. "It's what we're supposed to do." Miller turned, his face tight with anger. "I am taking this to the command, and your conduct will be reviewed," he said, already moving toward the door. "Do what you want, Captain," Dunlap called out, unimpressed. "I'm not changing a word of that report." Miller stepped out into the night, signaling his driver toward the 3rd Army headquarters. He knew the situation had moved beyond the station, beyond the MPs, and well into the reach of a man who did not tolerate lies. The report reached Patton within the hour. Patton's Jeep pulled up to the curb, tires crunching on the gravel. He stepped out, a figure of polished leather and brushed brass, his 4 stars catching the dim light of the street lamp. He moved with a heavy, steady cadence, the ivory-handled revolvers resting at his hips. A profound silence fell over the station, the air thickening as he crossed the threshold. He did not say a word, but every man in the room froze, sensing the weight of his arrival. Patton stopped before the sergeant, his eyes like flint. He tapped the arrest report, resting on the desk. "You wrote that this soldier was drunk and disorderly. Was he drunk?" Dunlap shifted, his face pale under the gaze. "He seemed to have trouble with his balance, General." Patton leaned closer, his voice low and cutting. "I asked you a simple question. Was he drunk?" Dunlap hesitated, then shook his head. "No, sir." "Was he disorderly?" "He was causing a scene, sir." "Was he aggressive?" The sergeant stood in silence, his eyes fixed on the floorboards, his mouth opening and closing without a sound. Patton stared at the man until the stillness became unbearable. "Every word on this report is a lie. You arrested a soldier for the crime of dancing. You have built a fortress of your own prejudices, Sergeant, and you have mistaken your uniform for a license to ignore the very laws you are sworn to protect. You think you are keeping order by enforcing a hierarchy that has no place in this army or in this world. You are wrong. You looked at a man who has carried a rifle through Italy and across the hedgerows of France, and you saw only what your small mind permitted you to see. You took his time, his honor, and his dignity because you were afraid of a dance. You have proven yourself unfit for the authority you carry. You have a choice. Comply with the order to make a full, public apology to both Corporal Hayes and Mademoiselle Delacroix, or face the consequences of your deception right here and now. Decide." The order was swift and immediate. Under the watchful eyes of the entire MP detachment, Dunlap was stripped of his authority. The very handcuffs he had used to bind the corporal were now placed on his own wrists. He was forced to stand in the center of the station, listening to the echoing silence of his peers who refused to meet his gaze. The smell of cold floor wax and stale cigarette smoke hung heavy in the room, mirroring the suffocating reality of his sudden downfall. Patton stood by, a statue of absolute resolve, while the detachment commander stepped forward to carry out the sentence. Dunlap was escorted out of the station and into the back of a canvas-covered transport, bound for the town square. There, under the bright, unforgiving midday sun, he stood before the mayor and Mademoiselle Delacroix. The apology was not a private matter. It was a public reckoning. As he offered his forced words, the villagers watched from the cobblestone streets, their faces unreadable but alert. The humiliation was total, a physical manifestation of the arrogance he had displayed only hours before. When it was finished, Dunlap was marched away, leaving the shadow of his own prejudice behind in the dust. Corporal William Hayes returned to his unit shortly after the incident, carrying a sense of quiet vindication that stayed with him for the duration of the war. He continued his service with the 366th with the same steady discipline he had always shown, eventually returning home to Baltimore in 1946. He lived a long, productive life as a tool and die maker, passing away peacefully in 1998. He rarely spoke of the incident in Verdun, but he kept his honorable discharge papers and a small, faded photograph of that dance hall in a locked wooden box on his dresser until his final day. Staff Sergeant Carl Dunlap's military career effectively ended on that afternoon in Verdun. After being stripped of his rank and relegated to menial labor duties, he served out the remainder of his enlistment in near total isolation from his peers. Following his discharge in 1945, he returned to Dayton, but the bitterness of his public demotion never truly faded. He lived a quiet, largely estranged life, working as a warehouse clerk, until his death in 1974. He remained a man who looked backward, nursing a quiet resentment toward the forces that had dismantled his worldview. General George Patton never mentioned the Verdun incident in his official memoirs, and he kept the original, heavily redacted arrest report in his personal desk files. In a brief, handwritten note to his wife, found years later, he alluded to the necessity of enforcing common decency when the pressures of command threatened to erode it. He wrote that he had no room in his ranks for men who fought for a hollow version of justice, noting that a soldier's worth was determined by his conduct, not by the biases of a petty, self-appointed judge. Some historians have argued that Patton's interventions were motivated more by a desire to maintain rigid internal order and discipline than by any genuine progressive social agenda. Others have argued the opposite, suggesting that his willingness to publicly humiliate his own officers for discriminatory acts provided a rare top-down check on systemic abuse during the chaos of the war. What is certain is that these confrontations left an indelible mark on the soldiers involved and created a lasting, factual precedent that rank-based entitlement would not be tolerated in the Third Army under his command. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same, or would you have simply looked the other way? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about what happens when old hierarchies met new realities, make sure to subscribe.